Well, Arne Duncan, thank you so much for making time with us here at Luminos. We're thrilled to have you as one of our guests in this series of conversations that we're having with education leaders who have played some role in helping their education systems navigate through crisis. So thrilled to have you. And why don't we dive in? The first question I have for you, Arne, is take us back to your childhood and tell us about what it was like growing up for you. And what role did education have in helping you build a vision for who you might become as an adult?
Well, I look at all the books behind you, and I grew up in a bit of all you know is your own household. You don't know anything different. Only when you get a little older do you find out things are a little different. But both my parents were educators. My dad was a professor at the University of Chicago, and we basically grew up on the campus of the University of Chicago. I live 2 blocks now from where I grew up. My mom was an educator as well. She ran an inner city after school tutoring program that had a huge influence on my life and my sister and brother. But we grew up in a household only with books and no TV. And I used to have to sneak to my friend's house once in a while to watch TV. But our parents, read to us every night, and just a different, a different appreciation of the importance of education, of reading books, and that was instilled in all of us. And my sister went on to be an educator. My brother went on to be an educator. And it's actually funny. I married an educator. My sister married an educator. My brother married an educator. So somehow we couldn't quite escape the family business.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating. So everybody's married to an educator. Well, there's another space in which you learned a range of different things, and I think that's the game of basketball. I grew up playing basketball myself, so as I read about you, and just I was thrilled to learn that basketball played a big role in your life. Tell us about playing basketball at Harvard and in Australia, and what lessons about leadership, teamwork, and communities came out of those experiences.
Well, let me take you back a few years before that. Really, started to play at my mother's after-school program, and began to love the game. So at 12, 13, 14, I started to go into the south and west sides of Chicago by myself to go play, because that's where the best basketball was. And if you wanted to get good, you had to play with against the best and challenge yourself. And I say all the time, I was so blessed to go to amazing schools and have amazing teachers and professors, but the best classroom I had was the basketball court, and on a couple different fronts. First, to me, growing up in some really tough neighborhoods, playing there, just learning to read character. And there are people who's you didn't know their names, maybe you knew their nicknames, and there some people you literally entrusted your life to help get you in and out of neighborhoods, and other people you learn to sort of stay away from. And I don't want to say I'm perfect at it, but by any stretch, but I can read a con pretty well. I can see when someone's not straight. I can see when someone has my best interest in heart and doesn't. And I had to do that to survive. And that was it was a tough, you can say it's a tough time, but that was a gift the game gave me. The second thing is, you said you can't fake who you are on the basketball court. And basketball both builds and it also reveals character. So if you have ego, if you have fear, if you're scared, if you wilt when things are tough, all those things come out. You can't hide those traits. And then the flip side is also maybe cliches, but for me they're very real. All the lessons around teamwork and hard work and unselfishness and resiliency, and just when we played, there'd be 20, 30 guys waiting to play. So if you lost, you had to sit out for a couple of hours. And if you wanted to play, you had to figure out a way to win, and just figuring out what it took to help your team win. And there've been times in my life when I've been the star of the team, the best player, and there've literally been times when I was the water boy, and figuring out how in every role in between there, you just try and contribute to the team. Just a unbelievably invaluable learning experience, formative. And without that, there's no way any of the little bit of success I've been able to have never would have happened. I don't say that lightly. Never would have happened without what the game of basketball and the characters and the different courts, what all of that taught me.
So Arne, in your 2018 book entitled How Schools Work, you just a segue from basketball, you mentioned a young basketball player, Calvin Williams, who you had the privilege and opportunity to tutor at Sue Duncan's Children's Center. Tell us about Calvin and sort of what you learned from him.
Yeah, that was one of those sort of pivotal formative moments. And I took a year off. It's a little bit, a little bit non-traditional. I took a year off between my junior year and senior year to basically write my senior thesis about my mother's program. And that was largely the reason I took that year off. But honestly, partly, it was a chance to really test myself. And most of my friends were, applying to law school or thinking about becoming investment bankers and going to Wall Street. And I was really trying to figure out, was my mother's work, was that a piece of who I was, or was that truly in heart, like who I was? And wanted to find that out before I had to enter the real world. And during that year, I sort of decided, I didn't know how or why or even what it meant, but I became pretty clear that this work was who I was what I wanted to do. But yeah, Calvin was, he was 4 years below me. So I was a rising senior in college. He was a rising senior in high school. He played, that's not his real name, he used a pseudonym, but he played for the local high school, Martin Luther King High School. It was a basketball powerhouse, great teams, won state championships. He lived literally just right around the corner from where my mother's program was in church basement, like less than half a block away. He was a much better player than I was, really a good player. Came along to help get ready for his ACT. And I was thrilled to, say, yeah, let's get to work. Let's figure out what that takes. And I'll never forget when we just started to work. He was probably, reading and writing at a third, fourth, maybe fifth grade level at best. And what broke my heart was he was a B student at his high school. He's actually on the B honor roll. He had sort of been passed through the system. So he had no idea how far behind he was. And I remember trying to sort of keep a little bit of a poker face and not sort of reveal all what I was thinking. But as we started working, just feel this utter devastation at how far behind he was. And what killed me was not where he was, but how that had been allowed to happen. He had played by all the rules. He had stayed out of the gangs, never smoked, never drank. We worked in a really tough environment. He was like immune from that, above all that. He had done everything right. And the school system, the public education system, had let him down. And, this was one of the nicest, great kid who was, trying to play by the rules, and it didn't work for him. And so we worked, but we only had a couple months in that summer before I was going back to school, and then he was starting senior year. And I sort of knew that he was not going to get to the point academically where he could get a Division I scholarship and play big time basketball and do the kind of things I would have loved to have done. I wasn't good enough to do. And it was one of those moments. I many growing up from my mother's program, but that was one that if the system doesn't work for the kids that are doing everything right, then the system is broken. And it made me that much more determined to come back and to help out and try and create something that was much more fair, much more challenging, much more honest, much more transparent. Because I just thought of all the talent, how many other Calvin Williams were there, in our community, across the South Side, across the West Side, across our country. Kids with great heart and great intent and great ability, but just never really given a chance. And that's our fault as educators. That's our fault as leaders. It's not our kids' fault.
So there was an interesting set of circumstances that took you from that experience right to the CEO role at Chicago Public Schools, where you worked under Mayor Daley. Take us through that journey and give us a sense of what it was like to be CEO in Chicago.
Yeah, I'll back up. Lucky enough to play professional basketball for 4 years in Australia after I graduated, and then came back and ran a nonprofit here, working out of the same church basement with my sister that my mother worked out of. We ran an I Have a Dream program for 6 years, where our job was to help take a group of sixth graders from sixth grade through 12th grade, and promising to help pay for their college education. best friend and mentor and role model, John Rogers, who runs Aero Capital Management, funded that program for us. It was just a chance to try and build upon all my mother's work. And when those young kids, when they graduated from high school, we thought about taking another class of 40. We had started a small public school during that time called Aerial Community Academy that when it grew was going to have 400 students. And then the Chicago Public Schools had 400,000 students at that time. There was something about the math from 40 to 400 to 400,000. And very honestly, most of my life, working with my mother, the public schools, because they weren't strong, they weren't good, where we worked, had basically been the enemy. And what we were always trying to do sort of at night from 3 o'clock to 8 o'clock in the afternoons, what we thought the school should have been doing from 8 o'clock in the morning to 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So it took a lot of soul searching, honestly, but ultimately decided that it's very easy to be a critic. It's very easy to throw stones from the outside. It's a different thing to sort of roll up your sleeves and try and go inside a bureaucracy and try and drive change. And ultimately decided to test myself that that I wanted to take sort of the harder route there. I didn't go there with any intent of becoming the CEO. Just wanted to help and learn. And about 2.5 years in, the previous CEO, Paul Vallis, left to run for governor, and the mayor picked me. And I'm sure that many days he regretted that choice. It was either a very courageous or a very dumb choice on his part. I was 36 years old, and just 2 years at working the bureaucracy. But I think honestly, he had some sense of my heart and my commitment and how much that it meant to me and to my family. And so he took a real chance on me. And I can give you a million lessons and things that worked and things that didn't work. But just trying to build a system of 600 in schools and 25,000 employees and 400,000 students, a system that worked better for kids, and huge emphasis on high quality early childhood education, trying to get our babies off to a good start, trying to really add rigor. And one of the things you're real proud of was not just increasing high school graduation rates, but doubling the number of students taking and passing AP classes, and just trying to create those kinds of opportunities. And then we just worked so hard to try and make sure more young people were not just going to college, but graduating. And for me, I've always loved education and totally value education for education's sake. But for me, it's always been the only way I knew how to break cycles of poverty. Everyone who went to my mother's program was poor. That's just where we worked. No one had family members who had gone to college and been to college. And for me, our goal was always to try and break those cycles of poverty and to give kids a chance to graduate and to go to college and fulfill their real academic and social potential. So it was just an extraordinary learning opportunity, an amazing team, and just, not just the academic part, but labor management, negotiations, and operations and facilities. And unfortunately spent a lot of time thinking about violence, and we had far too many of our students, shot and killed, never in a school, thank goodness, but just all the things that, there's not a manual that trains you, but just the reality of what you're working with. We served tens of thousands of kids, 3 meals a day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. We had a couple thousand kids that we very quietly, discreetly sent them home on Friday afternoons with a backpack full of food, because we worried about them not eating over the weekend. And for me, my mother always said, first thing she did every day as kids would walk into a program, first thing she always did was feed everybody. And she always just said, it's hard to learn when your stomach's growling, just real basic stuff. And so for me, I was always going to push for high academic standards and rigor and more AP classes and more kids going to college. But you had to make sure kids were fed. You had to make sure the social and emotional needs were met. You had to make sure they had eyeglasses if they needed eyeglasses. If they needed dental care, you had to take care of that. If you needed food, that's the foundation. You do that, and then let's talk about AP chemistry and biology and physics. And those two things have to work hand in hand.
So those must be some of the elements and ingredients that help you prepare your mind for that leap in scale. You mentioned sort of 40 students at the Children's Center, the 400 in the charter school, and then the 400,000 in the district, in the public school system. How do you prepare your mind and heart to take those leaps and build continuously build on those very important details that you mentioned.
Yeah, and again, not that I did any of this perfectly and made lots and lots of mistakes along the way, still making lots of mistakes every day. But I'll just say what I tried to do. One was trying to build the strongest, best, most diverse teams around you. And we all have strengths and we all have weaknesses, but you can't do any of this work, by yourself. And just bringing in, whether it was amazing educators, whether it was folks from the business community, whether it's folks from the faith-based community, the nonprofit community, just a range of different backgrounds and experiences. I always had a youth advisory council of teens who I took their, I ran all my policy stuff by them, got great feedback. It's amazing, still in touch with some of those young people who are now, in their careers, and just to remember them when they were 15 or 16, it's so inspiring. So you have to build really, really strong teams that the most important thing for me is that they're willing to tell you when you're crazy, you have a bad idea. And I've watched far too often, and quite candidly, we're seeing it, I think, here nationally, where, sometimes you get power, you just surround yourself by yes men and people who tell you, how smart you are, how good your ideas are. I don't, it doesn't make you any better. It may feed your ego a little bit. It doesn't make you better. In fact, it makes you a lot worse. And I've seen the dangers of that. I've seen, leadership crumble when you lack that. So people who could, challenge your ideas, come up with much better ideas, see things that you could never see, look around corners that you didn't even know existed. That's critically important. The second thing is trying to just have a couple priorities. And the systems are so large and so big that you could easily have a 50-point agenda. I just think, I see myself, I don't know how to move in a 50-point agenda effectively. We always try to have it, and it changed over time, but what are the 3 things that we're trying to become world-class at? And really disciplining yourself to spend time every single day trying to get better on those things and being very, very clear about your priorities and not trying to be all things to all people. And I remember an early conversation with funders that so surprised them. I said, here are my priorities. If you want to fund them, great. If you want to do 20 other things, you can do it, but that doesn't really help me. And I think people weren't used to that sort of level of candor, but heard for years that people sort of appreciated that and trying to sort of line that up. And then again, just being open to outside ideas, outside influences. We had the consortium on Chicago School Research, which was third-party, independent, that was always evaluating our work and telling us hard truths and stuff that, maybe you didn't want to hear, but you desperately needed to hear to make you better. Just being open to that feedback and adjusting and things we did to, for example, a real focus on keeping freshmen on track because that was so correlated to high school graduation rates. Those insights that seem so intuitive now, we truly didn't know, and getting that help, getting that feedback really helped us adjust our strategy. So trying to build really strong teams, really diverse teams that will challenge your thinking every single day, trying to be very clear on a small set of priorities and then spending time against those. And then the final thing I'll say is that in those kinds of positions, there's always crisis management. Unfortunately, that's part of what you do, but that can also consume you. And so you have to be disciplined. Yes, you have to deal with the real crises of the day, but if that's all you're doing, again, you're just perpetuating what's already there, which for me, the status quo wasn't good enough for far too many kids. So you have to discipline your time. Your time is your most valuable resource. Discipline your time to do some crisis response, some crisis management, but to really work against your strategic priorities, your strategic imperatives every single day and chip away at that. Otherwise, you're not going to get where you need to go.
That's really helpful to understand. Thank you. So if taking the Chicago experience, if you had to put a few things into the wins column and others into the loss column, what would you put in both places?
Yeah, always lots in both. So again, the focus on early childhood education was huge and really, really important. The fact that we never missed a day of school, we never had a strike. Here in Chicago, we never had a snow day. I used to have people furious at me for not calling it a snow day. But for me, it was never just about education. It's like we talked earlier, for many kids, those were the only meals they were getting every single day. And I just took that responsibility very, very seriously to keep our doors open. We had single moms who relied on us for childcare when they were trying to work a job or 2 jobs or whatever it may be. So just trying to, we never missed a day. So I'm actually really proud of that for any reason. Seeing academic progress get better, seeing those graduation rates go up, seeing the going from tens to hundreds of millions of dollars in college scholarships that our students were earning. That was huge. We worked really hard to increase the caliber of teachers coming to Chicago Public Schools. Spent a lot of time universities in the Midwest and nationally trying to attract that talent and getting folks coming in with higher GPAs and from a range of different schools. And just I always say that there's nothing more important than a great teacher in every classroom and a great principal in every building. So that human capital piece of what we did was really important. Keeping our schools as safe as possible, and again, unfortunately, in a very violent city and very violent communities, having our schools be safe. And the flip side of that, which is interesting, particularly now, of making sure that we weren't perpetuating the school to prison pipeline, and making sure that kids weren't being arrested when something happened. And we found out early on that we were actually part of that. That was very real. That was a tough reality, a tough lesson, a tough truth to absorb. But training principals to figure out when kids present with a problem, do you deal with the symptom of the problem? Do you deal with the anger or the outburst, or do you deal with the underlying cause of the problem? Whether that's violence at home, whether it's a mom getting beaten up, whether it's a friend being shot, whether it's something in the community, do you help that student work through those issues and help them get to a place where they can self-regulate and learn or not? So those are all things, again, and let me be clear, none of this is ever mission accomplished. None of this is ever you get where as far as you want to go. You just try and make as much progress as you can, as long as you can, but there's always more work to do. One of the things that's been most gratifying for me is recently research out of Stanford University showed Chicago to be the fastest improving urban school district in America. And back when we were working, before that, it had been called the worst big city school district in America. And so just to see the progress sustained over time, that honestly feels really, really good.
So we get to 2008, President Obama becomes president, and you find yourself taking another leap in scale to not just serving Chicago public schools, but presiding over the entire nation. Tell us about that. And again, keeping in line with this idea of wins and losses, give us a sense of what that journey was.
Yeah, so you go from 400,000 students to 52 million. That's a pretty big leap. But started to think and plan, and the range is obviously early childhood, K-12, and higher ed. You sort of have that whole span, and always trying to think about what's the role of federal education, or the federal government in education, I should say, and it plays differently at the early childhood level, K-12, and higher ed. And I knew a lot about urban education. My rural street cred was not high, so I spent a disproportionate amount of my time in rural America, Appalachia, other places. Visit schools in all 50 states. I always say you don't learn sitting behind your desk, so I was on the road all the time and just trying to talk to real kids and real teachers and principals, and learn so much through that journey. And honestly, probably during that time, visited over 7 years, hundreds and hundreds of schools. I probably visited more schools across the country than anybody, and that's just an unbelievable privilege of that job. I'd never been to a Native American reservation. Thought I knew poverty, thought I knew social challenges, thought I knew violence from a lifetime of work here in Chicago. But that, I got to tell you, that was a whole different level. It was both unbelievably devastating and heartbreaking, but also deeply inspiring. Tried to go visit as often as I could, speak at tribal college graduations, and trying just to soak that up as much as you can as I could. So I'll give you wins and losses. I'll give you wins first. One was a focus on early childhood education, common theme there. Us being able, historically our department did almost nothing in that space, and we were able to get over $1 billion from Congress to create high quality slots for a couple 100,000 students, across the young kids across the country, and that felt fantastic. Secondly, we were able to get high school graduation rates to a historic high, so about 84%. In every subgroup of students, white, Black, Latino, Native American, English language learners, special needs, poverty students, didn't matter, everybody getting better. I desperately wish the current administration had a goal of 90%. Unfortunately, they're not very interested in education, but seeing that increase. really focused on community colleges and not our department. Department of Labor put several billion behind there. And I just love visiting community colleges. For me, they were just this microcosm, the best of what our country is, and people from all walks of life, and 18-year-olds and 38-year-olds and 58-year-olds all trying to learn and retrain and retool and gain the skills necessary to support their families. So a real significant investment there. Then we also able to get an additional $30 billion for Pell Grants to make colleges much more affordable. And that was wildly controversial in DC. We thought it was common sense. We simply cut out the middleman in terms of making grants, did it ourselves. Didn't go back to taxpayers for a single nickel. Went from 6 million to 9 million Pell recipients, so a 50% increase, and saw an additional million students of color, go on to college. That felt great. So those are some of the wins. On the losses, on the sides where you're less successful. And it's actually interesting. Early childhood for me is both a win and a loss. We were thrilled to do the $1 billion, but candidly would love to have done $10 billion, $20 billion, because there's that much need around the country. And we had so many states that wanted more access to high quality early learning, but very candidly, we weren't able to get some of our Republican friends in Congress to give us the kinds of funds to help them. So while the numbers increased, they didn't increase anywhere near as much as we wanted. Secondly, we failed to get anything done in terms of immigration reform. And for us, that would have meant a chance to have dreamers have access to college financial aid. And the fact that these young students work so hard, many are community leaders, some are valedictorians. America is a country, is their home, it's a country they love. The fact that they do all that work and we sort of cut off that opportunity once they graduate from high school. For me, we're cutting off our nose to spite our face. And these are the future job creators and innovators and entrepreneurs. And when we were here in Chicago, we had a fair number of dreamers, and my wife and I set up just a really, really small scholarship fund of just trying to help a couple students go to college, and just hearing their stories and getting to know them and their families, and the fact that this was such a difficult journey, didn't feel right at all, didn't feel close to right, and we weren't able to break through. And the final one is actually, it's a tough one to talk about, but it's real, is the issue of gun violence. And I've said this publicly, President Obama said this publicly, he by definition dealt with the hardest issues on the planet. That's what a normal president does. But the day of the Sandy Hook massacre in Newtown, Connecticut, where we had 20 children and 5 teachers and the principal killed, that was the hardest day of his presidency. And he went down the next day. Vice President Biden and I went down a couple of days after that, and just meeting those families and going to the funeral of the principal there. And it was unimaginable. And the fact as a country that we haven't done anything in terms of common sense gun control and keeping our kids and our families safe, free of trauma, free of fear. It's a desperate failure.
So in a 1995 speech in Tromsø, Norway, I believe, President Mandela talked about, and he was referencing the HIV/AIDS crisis at the time, and he talked to the audience about the need for the entire world to find decision makers who are driven by leadership, vision, and political courage. And so I imagine, as you're describing issues related to gun violence and early childhood and other things that you put into your lost column, what aspects of political courage had to define your time as U.S. Secretary of Education? What did you need to draw on in order to push the country in the direction that you needed to go?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's an interesting one that for me, I had just seen this example of moral clarity and moral courage all my life in my mother's program. And, I remember vividly, her life being threatened. I remember vividly, hearing shots and just lots of crazy things in the neighborhood. I remember vividly one time a man saying, if you come back here tomorrow, we're going to kill you. And here she brought her, white lady with her 3 white babies, brought all of us into the neighborhood every single day. And I don't remember how old I was at that point. It was maybe 8 or 9 or 10. but I remember that dinner time conversation clearly. And what I remember we sort of decided was that, I won't say we, she decided basically, and my father had some input that, if you show fear, if you start to run, you're going to keep running. And so we just went back the next day, and we were there and he wasn't. And we just kept working. And I just think about, it's funny, you go to DC and, you get all this, Secret Service and all the security. I'm like, I don't need you guys now. We could have used you guys, 30 years ago. We could have used some help. But I just had this example of moral clarity that I saw it every day. So for me, this is, none of this work took moral, didn't take, you just do the good work. And there are times with Mayor Daley here in Chicago, times with, President Obama, I go home to my wife and say, I might get fired tomorrow. She's like, okay, that's okay. We'll figure it out. And you just do the best you can. You try and do the right thing. And, not that you always, make the right decision, but as long as your motives are pure, as long as you're doing it for the right reason, then honestly, it's water off a duck's back. It's courage. And people sometimes say, oh, it takes great courage. I take this stand or that stand or whatever. And I'm like, honestly, this stuff is easy. And I just think about what kids are dealing with every day. And I think about what kids are overcoming, kids here in Chicago, just to get to school every single day. And that's real courage. I mean, that's unbelievable courage. We're just trying to make good decisions. I wouldn't even put that in the courage category. And so it was one where that if you're willing to fail, if you're willing to to lose your job, if you're doing things for the right reason, then you don't have much to fear. And just knowing the true courage that so many kids and teachers and principals around the country, real courage that they demonstrate every day. The least you can do is try and make good decisions to support them, and listen to them, and do things to make their jobs and their lives easier and better.
So in the face of opposition, say it was Race to the Top or Common Core or any of the other things that you were working on, where you recognize that in a political system, opposition will come, but you also need to keep your eye on the prize, which is getting the progress and the accomplishments that you're looking to. So how do you balance the wheel between navigating through opposition and challenge while also bringing the entire country together as a team to accomplish the goals that you're pursuing?
Yeah, so I always say, I happen to be a Democrat, but for me, education should be the ultimate bipartisan or nonpartisan issue. There's nothing left or right or liberal or conservative or Democrat or Republican about giving kids a great chance at life with a high quality early childhood education, or raising high school graduation rates, or trying to have more young people go to college. There shouldn't be anything political about that. Trying to keep kids safe from gun violence. There shouldn't be anything political, about that. And so you try and really listen where people who may disagree with you, and be open to that feedback and be open to change. And again, never be about yourself, your ego, but just about trying to present the best ideas for the right reasons. So it's a combination of, I try to listen very, very carefully and try to spend lots of time with people who, may not agree with me or may have a different perspective than me or whatever. And I thought those are chances for me to learn and get smart, and I learned a lot. But having said that, I also felt this tremendous urgency that, I didn't go there because I wanted to go to DC. I didn't go there because I wanted a position or title. I went there because I wanted to help a hell of a lot more kids get a better chance at life. And that time, those 7 years for me, they fly by, and you're trying to make real significant change in a short amount of time. So you try and couple a listening and an openness and a receptivity to different ideas and different thoughts with a tremendous sense of urgency that you just can't wait. And I think, DC moves at a glacial speed. Our kids have one chance to get an education. And so I also pushed very, very hard and got some critique, which I'm happy to, talk about for moving so fast and going so hard. My candid self-reflection, self-critique now, if anything, I wouldn't have slowed down. If anything, I would have gone even faster, because there's so much urgency and because there's so many kids who aren't being served well. So I don't ever say I got that balance, right. What I always try to check with our team is, I said, are we fighting for kids? Take all the politics out. And to be clear, we probably got as much pushback from the left as we did from the right. We got lots of pushback from both sides of the political spectrum for different reasons. But as long as we woke up every single day fighting for kids, as long as we were trying to make the right decisions for them, I could go home and sleep pretty well at night. And it's actually interesting to go back to the basketball that, used to, play in Australia and, playing in front of 20,000 people, and you got a free throw at the end of the game, and you got 20,000 people booing at you, doing everything they can to literally knock you off your game to make you miss. And it's weird. You sort of hear it, but you don't. You almost don't hear anything. You're just so focused on the the dribble and the shot and the basket. You sort of block all that noise out. And actually, that was great training for me. That where stuff is noise, where it's not really important, where it's trying to knock you off your game, you don't pay any attention to it. And so that I actually thought was helped me handle some of that stuff maybe better than others who hadn't had those kinds of experiences.
So at the high point of the coronavirus pandemic, we're told that 1.6 billion children across the world were forced out of school and had their learning disrupted. And many of those children are still facing the same situation. Leading those children are a range of education professionals across the world. And at the top of those pyramids, if you like, are ministers of education. And so given the role that you've had, Arne, what advice would you give to incoming or incumbent ministers of education across the world as they try to wrestle through what is an unprecedented crisis?
I say this, whatever I might say with tremendous humility, because every country has a different cultural context. And I spent a lot of time working with other ministers from across the globe when I was in DC, because I thought there's so much we could learn. And those are lonely positions. There's only one of you in each country and a chance to learn together and share. So there's always local cultural context. I will say I've just been devastated, and just always very honest, by the lack of leadership by the current Secretary of Education here in the United States, which is devastating impact on kids and teachers and education, on their health and safety and everything. So let me say what I would have wished we would have had the opportunity to do, were we still there, what other folks would do. One is you have to lead with tremendous honesty and transparency. You have to get facts out. When people are scared, you have to build trust. You have to build credibility. Can't be about spinning anything, can't be about any political agenda. You just got to let folks know with the coronavirus, as you know so well, not just week to week, but almost day by day, the information has changed. We're learning, we're getting smarter. No one's got this thing figured out yet. We're a lot smarter today. But to be totally transparent with all that information, letting folks know. Secondly, it's interesting, in education, it's almost like when people go to become a doctor, they take an oath to do no harm. That's like an interesting, you're now as a minister of education, as a superintendent of schools, now with the coronavirus, you have people's health and safety, their well-being, their life or death in your hands. That's an unbelievably weighty, heavy responsibility, and it should be. And so for me, the first thing has to be to do no harm. And as much as you want kids in a physical school building, if it's not safe to do so, then you can't do that. And I always say, schools and school districts aren't islands, they're not bubbles. The best way to bring kids back to physical school buildings is to beat down the virus in the communities where those schools are. And unfortunately, here in the United States, we've done just a horrific job of that, and that's why our kids are struggling so much. So until you can bring kids back in a physical situation, then you're thinking about a couple of things. I'll say what I've been doing now as a private citizen, but would have been doing the same thing as a Secretary of Education. One is schools are social safety nets. And so throughout this pandemic, I've done a weekly call with school superintendents, with nonprofits that feed kids across the country. And starting early in March, we've talked every single week. They have continued every single day throughout this pandemic to feed tens of millions of kids and their parents and younger brothers and siblings meals every single day. It's just been extraordinary work that's been so important. Secondly, again, you have to take care of young people's social and emotional health, and the amount of trauma that young people are dealing with, that they were dealing with prior to the pandemic. Now with the pandemic here in the United States, with the murder of George Floyd and other things, there's a level of trauma that, we haven't known before. So thinking about telehealth, telemedicine, counselors, social workers, school psychologists, reaching out to young people, trying to just help them deal with a terrifying time that we're all struggling with, quite frankly. And then the third piece is obviously, how do you pivot to sort of this virtual learning world, and access to internet, access to devices, trying to close the digital divide, helping teachers scale up, all of those things. But for me, it's again the same hierarchy. Goes back to my mother's program. It's crazy. Feed kids first, take care of their social emotional needs, and then let's figure out the educational piece. And that's what I think ministers of education across the globe are trying to do. And I always worry, there'll be a small percent of kids, largely affluent kids, that are probably flourishing during this time, where they might actually be accelerating educationally. There'll be a lot of kids that will be doing okay and not great, but there'll be a significant number of kids that have fallen desperately behind and that are almost like disappearing, that haven't even come back to school. And that for me is just so scary and so wrong. We have to do whatever we can to find those kids, to do home visits, to go out and reach out and bring that back in. Because if they had the COVID slide in the spring and the summer slide in the fall, and now some haven't returned to summer slide during summer and then haven't returned to school this fall, we have to find those kids. We have to bring them back. I would love to see here in the United States a national tutoring initiative, and we can see this in other countries as well, to help those kids that are furthest behind to catch up. High intensity tutoring, again, whether it's physically or virtually, recent college grads, retirees, retired teachers, whatever. Those that I always worry about, the most vulnerable, the most disadvantaged, the most disenfranchised children, and they always get hit the hardest with whatever societal changes are coming at them, and they're getting hit by a couple public health crises now.
Going back to the narrative in your book, you begin your book with this conversation about Calvin Williams, and you mentioned being in the car with your mother and driving up to the community center, and somebody appeared with a gun, and your mother had to sort of reverse very quickly to get out of that neighborhood. And I love how you described that as fast as you've seen your mother drive. But then fast forward to the end of your book, you have this really compelling narrative about a boy, Gabriel, in a classroom, and you describe his teacher as being a fantastic teacher who, I think this boy Gabriel had a family member, young brother, I think, who was gunned down, unfortunately. But you described the way that the teacher was preparing for Gabriel to come back and had a plan. And you also mentioned George Floyd in your comment. And Arne, the work that you're doing currently through the Emerson Collective is directly focused on trying to end gun violence. So yes, of course, we think about education. You mentioned the school to prison pipeline. There seems to be a connection, Arne, between the way we treat kids in community and the way we prepare them for learning in the classroom. Perhaps you could unpack everything I've said there to help us understand how to connect those two dots, particularly now, as we're seeing, as in your words, a world and a country that is hugely in trauma, and people are making poor decisions across the board. But we need to turn this ship around in order to save our kids. What have you learned that could help us do that differently?
Well, I can see how much you study this stuff, so I think you could teach us a lot about it. I know I can just tell by your question how much you've thought about this, but it's such a difficult and dark and frankly scary time. But what this pandemic has done is it has pulled the scab off, pulled the bandage off these gaping wounds of inequities in every part of our society, in healthcare, in access to food, and yes, in access to education as well. And it's so interesting, this term socially distanced, that's a new term, but the communities and kids that I've always cared about and worked with, those communities have been socially distanced forever. They've been disenfranchised, they've been marginalized, they've been disinvested in, they've been redlined, they've been denied access to resources. And kids growing up in those communities, the lack of those opportunities have a devastating impact. And what I've seen all my life is that talent is evenly spread and opportunity is not. And I can give you story after story, just from my mother's program. And I, told one, I use his name because, Kerry Holly, who was a young man who taught us, and he was pretty typical for that community. Never knew his father. Mother was candidly a prostitute, was in and out of his life, was raised by his grandmother. I thought I knew him. He was like a big brother. My mother sort of helped raise him, and I thought I knew him really well. I went back to interview him for my book, and he said, "Let me tell you my birth story." I'd never heard his birth story. And his birth story was when he was born, his mother wrapped him in newspaper and threw him in the garbage can. And his grandmother took him out of the garbage can and raised him. And Kerry Holly not only taught me for years, went on to get a law degree, has done amazing work in the tech world, has patents, has traveled the world. And I think about this young man starting his life literally in a garbage can. He tried to come to my mother's program for a while, and she had too many kids. She wouldn't let him in. He just kept showing up, and eventually forced his way in. And she, saw how smart he was, how good he was, getting huge responsibility. He was managing the checkbook for the program when he was 13, 14, was teaching us by the time he was 15, 16. But I think about how many Kerry Hollies there are in communities everywhere across our country and across the globe. And Kerry Holly had a chance because he was born about a block from my mother's program. But I think about, had he been born 4 blocks away or 6 blocks away or a mile away, what would have happened to him? And so what we have to do is we have to make sure opportunity meets that talent wherever it is. And I think that's been my, trying to be my life's work, is trying to make sure educationally opportunity makes that talent. Now trying to remove the fear and trauma of gun violence to prevent kids from being able to even focus educationally or academically or plan for a long haul because they're trying to survive. It is never the kids' fault. It's never our young people's fault. It's always us as adults who haven't provided the structure and the guidance and the love and the support and the high expectations to give them a chance to be successful. And what I've seen all my life is that when you provide those things, I don't even call it, people call it beating the odds. I don't even call it beating the odds. What you've done is you actually change the odds, and then young people can thrive and blossom and flourish and do extraordinarily well. So I know what's possible. It's not some like hope in the unseen or hope in some whatever. I have literally seen it all my life, continue to see it. And so that's the driving force of where you have these massive inequities, when you have, systemic racism, structural racism, where you have, here in the United States, 400 years of a cancer on our soul that we haven't had the courage to deal with. None of this is easy. None of this can be fixed overnight. But we owe it to our young people. We owe it to our communities. We owe it to our country to challenge these things that have been absolutely broken and try and do something better. And that's my desperate hope of coming out of this, that we can, create something better. My goal is not to go back to quote unquote normal, whatever that was for education, because that wasn't good enough for people. I don't want normal. I want to reimagine. I want to reinvent. I want to create something new. And if we have the courage to do that, that would be extraordinary. There's a famous quote that the arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I think about that a lot. It only bends towards justice if we put in the work to make it bend towards justice. It doesn't happen naturally. It doesn't happen inevitably. I would argue the past 3+ years here in the United States, it has bent away from justice in some very, very dangerous and difficult and scary ways. And so that's sort of the onus on all of us in our generation of, can we bend that arc back towards justice? And that's what this work is in terms of what we're trying to do for kids and what we're trying to do to build healthy and safe and strong communities in which they can grow up and thrive and prosper.
Arne, you've been a wonderful guest. If you don't mind, I have just 3 short questions for you to close us off here. Towards the end of your book, you provided, I think, 6 really compelling lessons. I'll just shoot them off for you here. You said that every family should have access to high-quality pre-K education for a 4-year-old, that there should be after-school enrichment provided to every child. Social, emotional, and physical needs need to be met. Every school needs a great principal and every classroom a great teacher. High schools should graduate their students with college credit and or industry certification. And finally, high schools need to match graduates to colleges that are quite serious about graduating students the right way. Do you still stand by those 6 principles today?
100%. Absolutely.
And how, talk a little bit about how they're relevant or even more so in the context of our current pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, for me, that I happened to write that a couple of years ago, but I would have believed all those things 20 or 30 years ago. I think I'll believe all those things 20 or 30 years from now. So there's nothing about any time period. Again, just for me, if anything, the sense of urgency has only heightened, has only increased. And the cost of academic failure is so high now. I said, when I was growing up, I had friends that dropped out of high school, and while it wasn't great here in Chicago, they could go work in the stockyards or steel mills and get a pretty good job and support a family and own a home and really do okay. As you know, those jobs are gone and they're never coming back. And if young people drop out of high school today, they're basically condemned to poverty and social failure. There are no good jobs out there. So again, if we're trying to break cycles of poverty, if we're trying to open up ladders to upper mobility and chances to go from poverty to the middle class, the only way to do that is through high quality education. And that's going to become more and more true. So if anything, the importance of all those things is going to increase with time, not decrease.
So one more time, let's go back to your childhood. Arne, were there books that stick in your mind today that really influenced you as a child?
Well, again, we sort of had this, I told you, it was a good place to end up where we started. We had this crazy family with no TV. So what we would do every night was, again, funny, we'd get home at 8 or 8:30 from my mother's program. We'd eat dinner, 8:30 or 9, and then, shower. And then our dad would read to us at night. And we did this for years and years and years. It was an amazing time. So these books are a little dated, but the Tolkien series, that was sort of Harry Potter before there was Harry Potter. We read that probably 2 or 3 times, the whole series. That was really impactful. Tom Sawyer, Huck Finn. And I remember my dad, he was man of few words, didn't preach much, but I remember him saying that every part of American society is revealed in Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn, and both the beauty of America and the poison of America and the racism of America. It was all in there. As a kid, it just sort of made you think and start to understand the hidden meaning of stuff. So those were the Tolkien series, and then reading the Mark Twain's his classics. Those are ones that were very influential for me as a young boy.
I wish we could keep running the tape here. There's so much to learn from you, and you speak so passionately about education, and it's just wonderful to hear the huge influence that your parents had, that you played basketball both as an athlete and as a learner, and that you continued to put children first in everything that you did. Arne, what final words might you have for your listeners and viewers today?
Well, one, just to appreciate your tremendous thoughtfulness, and you did a ton of homework for this interview, I can tell. So just appreciate everything that you're doing. I just think, I don't want to sugarcoat it. For me, this is a really dark time, a tragic time. It's a natural disaster that here in the United States has morphed into a man-made catastrophe. We shouldn't be here. We shouldn't have this number of deaths. Shouldn't have education impacted the way it is, but here we are. And so all I can say is, now more than ever, we need real leadership. We need real humility. We need compassion and urgency and the willingness to work together. Our children need us now more than ever before. And what do I hope? My kids are a little bit older. I have a daughter who started college a couple of weeks ago, and a son in high school. And all I can hope is during this time that's, again, very, very challenging at so many levels, I hope they're learning the importance of science. I hope they're learning the importance of participating in our democracy and voting. I hope they're really learning about empathy and compassion and fairness, that if our family is okay, but if our neighbor's family isn't, or someone down the block or wherever it might be, that we are all inextricably linked, and we can't be okay until everybody's okay. And so my hope, and again, I don't know, my hope is that if our kids, here in the United States and across the globe are learning these lessons around empathy and fairness and compassion and how our common humanity, how we're so tied together, if we can learn those lessons, then my hope, my dream would be the next 30, 40, 50 years, as those young people become the next generation of leaders, they could lead us to a very, very better place, a much, much better place. That's my hope. I think it's, again, our responsibility and our amazing opportunities as adults, not to talk about those lessons, but to try and live them as best we can.
Arne, thank you so much. I almost forgot my bonus question, which is, if you'll indulge me, what was it like working with President Obama?
Yeah, it was just an amazing, amazing opportunity. And I didn't go to DC because I wanted to move to DC. I wanted that title. I went because he was a personal friend. I knew how committed he was to education. I knew what it meant in his life. I grew up, good friends, playing basketball all the time with Michelle Obama's older brother, Craig. Amazingly strong family, neither parent college educated, knew how much education had meant to Craig and to Michelle. And so being able to work with someone whose heart was so committed to kids, that was a dream come true. It was hard, it was difficult. I would do it all again in a heartbeat, wouldn't think twice.
Well, this has been fabulous. I really do appreciate you. Thank you for taking time. And from the Luminos family, please continue doing what you're doing and inspiring us and making a difference for people everywhere.
Okay, thanks so much. Really, really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.